Hello, this is a video response to Michael Payton. His video is the is-ought fallacy really a fallacy? I will first start by explaining, well, what really is a fallacy. From my understanding, a fallacy is only a fallacy when it tries to argue for something that it isn't. For example, it would not be a fallacy if you were asking me, was Barack Hussein Obama elected president of the United States? I said, well, yeah, he was, and he is, because most Americans voted for him. You can't say, oh, that's ad populum, because that's exactly what you were asking. You can't say, if you're asking me, does science support man-made climate change or evolution? And when I cite a scientist, you can't say, oh, that's appeal to authority, because that's what you asked. And you cannot say, if you were asking me what is the definition of something, and I give you the definition, and then you say, oh, that's circular reasoning or begging the question. That didn't answer my question, because that's what you asked. If anything, you are committing the fallacy of equivocation. So to avoid using fallacies, the best way to avoid such a confusion would be to define your terms. So keep in mind, a fallacy only is a fallacy if it tries to argue for something that it isn't. If the question is asked, the terms are defined, and the person answers the question that fits the terminology and definitions, it might not be sensible in a different context, but if it answers the question, it's not a fallacy. You cannot say that a person is committing a fallacy if all they did was answer what you asked them. So I think what he's saying here is that the distinction between prescriptive and descriptive, or is-ought, we've all heard this, that there's a gap between what is and what ought to be. I think before we argue whether there is a connection between, or is there a gap between is and ought, we ought to actually qualify and define what ought means. For example, when we say you ought not to kill somebody, do we really mean you ought not to kill anybody under any circumstances, period? And if we did, what would be the consequence of that? I don't think we do mean that. In fact, I think we mean, when we say you ought not to kill somebody, we mean in order to have a good society, if you want to get along with the rest of society and you want to follow the rules of society, if you want to be a moral person and avoid being sent to prison, you ought to follow our rules, and one of them is don't kill somebody. So as soon as you define what is your goal, or what is the motive of doing something or not doing something, then ought becomes obvious. If you want to die by slitting your throat, you would take a knife and remember it's down the road, not across the street. If you want to win the lottery, then you ought to at least buy a ticket. But even if you were to answer what is and what ought and what is right or wrong, you still don't know what right, unless you actually know what right and wrong mean, then it doesn't get us much. For example, what does it mean to say that lying is wrong? Does it mean you will 100% of the time never lie? Or does it mean that it's a general suggestion that if you do not lie, for the most part, for all practical purposes, it'll most likely get you the best results, with few exceptions, but you're probably on the safe side if you follow the rule and not lie. If our question was consequentialist, then there would be no ambiguity. Basically, then lying would be something you ought not to do if the consequences are bad. And vice versa, if lying were to produce good consequences, then it probably would turn into an ought, assuming we want good consequences. If the ought were defined as follow the rule, no if, and, or but, then by that definition, lying is always wrong regardless of the consequences. Michael, you say that Hume is not that interested in language. I'm guessing you're saying he's not into semantics either, and nor am I. So whenever the topic of morality comes up, instead of arguing with somebody whether there is or isn't objective morality, I simply really am more interested in asking them, how do they express and act on what they believe as morality? What I'm saying is that if somebody believes lying and killing is wrong, do they 100% of the time not do it? If not, then what do they mean? Or if a person unconditionally doesn't lie or kill or steal, does it really matter what he believes about whether it's right or wrong? Now, this reminds me of a little about listening to Sam Harris's lecture. He basically says that it is possible for science to arrive at a conclusion of objective morality. And by objective, he basically means something that is true irrespective of a person's interpretation. Dr. Harris basically believes that you can scientifically measure the consequences or the moral outcome of a given situation or decision. And he actually defines what he means by what is right or wrong, or what is morally good or bad. He basically is a consequentialist, and he basically defines what is right or wrong based on minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness, or something to that extent. So, not to put words in his mouth, but I think if I were to sit down with him and ask him, Dr. Harris, if at a given time we could scientifically calculate that lying, stealing, and cheating on your wife would produce the maximum desirable consequences, minimize suffering for all humanity, and by the way, cause zero suffering, and scientifically we could calculate that there is no probability of having long-term consequences, and for the next two lifetimes we can guarantee that nobody would be harmed and only people would be helped by specific instances of lying, stealing, and cheating on another person's spouse. Would that be the right thing to do? I think he would have a hard time saying that's wrong, because from a consequentialist point of view, you would basically have to go with consequences. And I will be honest, I don't understand how people can not be consequentialists, or people who claim they are not consequentialists. I think when you follow them and see what they put into action, they're actually hypocrites. They claim to be higher or better than consequentialism and say that they believe principles and rules are more important, but they don't live it and they don't act it. So, I mean, what do you say? Talk is cheap. I'm not interested in people who only talk and not act. People who say they do something and do something other than what they claim they believe.